Congressman Jerry Litton believes that a democracy depends on informed people. He also believes our government should be more open and accessible to the people. To better inform you of what is happening in your government, Missouri's 6th District Congressman Jerry Litton invites Washington personalities to come to Missouri each month and join him in an unrehearsed, question and answer, open to the public town meeting to discuss key issues facing our nation. Dialogue with Litton brings you closer to your government and Washington closer to you.
Do you know this is the start of the 4th year of these monthly Dialogue with Litton meetings? 4th year. And I was asked a little bit earlier today if I was elected to the United States Senate, as we expect to be, if we would continue the dialogue programs every month, and I said, you better believe we will. I thought it was appropriate at the start of the 4th year of these meetings that we have as our guest a man whose father, the late Franklin D. Roosevelt, really took government to the people with his fireside chats from the Oval Room of the White House, and whose mother, Eleanor, gave the people the hope that we need so badly right now, and a man who in his own right has served the public for many, many years, whose mention of his name causes excitement among the young and the old. We have a number of senior citizens who came in here for this meeting today, and I was pleased to note that we have quite a number of youngsters from schools that came in too. So I think just the mention of his name creates excitement among the young and the old. He served in the United States Congress for 3 terms. He served as Undersecretary of Commerce in the Kennedy administration, was very important in the campaign of John Kennedy. He's a friend of mine. He's a successful businessman. He's still involved in politics in the East. Let's welcome to Missouri Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. Franklin, I was looking in my records and I found that on this day in 1743, 233 years ago in Boston, they had the first public town meeting in the United States. And isn't that interesting that we bring it right back here today?
Well, that's I think you've taken a good page out of history.
I think
I want to just say, talking of history, though, I'm delighted to see that your theme song is Happy Days Are Here Again. and I also was very flattered that they played The Sidewalks of New York when I walked in. So that was Al Smith's theme song, and of course, Al didn't win, but Happy Days won for the old man.
They did.
I'm not making any prophecies, Jerry, but I'm wishing you lots of luck.
I met some of my friends here, and some of the young people, a little young, I told them they didn't remember FDR, and then I met some of my friends, and I asked if they remembered you, and they said, no, they're older than that, they remember your father.
Well, I think they probably are reading about him in school, but I've had 2 people earlier today in this wonderful crowd come up and remind me that I gave the keynote speech at the Democratic State Convention in Jefferson City 25 years ago. So when I was in Congress.
Is that right?
So I do have some personal friends, too.
I know you do. Before we get into the questions, a lot of people were interested in the story of your family on television recently. How did you feel sitting there watching the pages of history turn that you had been so close to?
Well, it was a very moving experience. The second half I saw with Jane Alexander, who played my mother in the two films, at Joe Lash's house. And Joe Lash, of course, was the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who wrote the Ellen and Franklin and the Ellen of the Years Alone, on which those two films were based. I've heard some criticism that it was too much about Eleanor and it didn't have enough about FDR, but of course it really only took my mother and father up to, through the governorship and up to 1902. And those of you who liked those two programs will be pleased to know that ABC and the producers are going to now make a 3-hour special on the presidential years. And then they're planning a 4th, which will be a 2-hour special on the Ellen of the Years Alone after my father died, and of course when she became so active in the United Nations and in the homes of people all over the world. But I think that we were very lucky to have such a remarkable pair of actors in Ed Herman playing my father and Jane Alexander playing my mother. And several times during those two shows, I had to pinch myself to remind myself that it was not my mother and it was not my father, that they were just two very good friends who were acting the parts. But they did a remarkable job, and I think most of you who saw it will agree it was a remarkable job.
You know, of course, you're very interested and excited in history and government and politics, and that's what we've done with these meetings here, starting our 4th year. And the majority, I think, of the people in this room were not particularly active in politics prior to the start of these meetings. And we've taken government back to the people and caused them to be, I think, excited, interested, involved, and participants in it to the extent they haven't been before.
Well, Jerry, I'd just like to say one word about that. I have known about this Dialogue with Litton program since you and Sharon came to visit me at Clove Creek Farm. And I must tell you in passing, that shows you what a big man can do. I raised polled Herefords, and for a Charolais breeder to come and see a polled Hereford farm, that's pretty good. But this program, and I was just saying to Sherry earlier, I'm sure that many of you here would look at the headline and then say, well, that's politics, and you'll skip the story. But I think by this program, you now see the headline. You may see a headline about somebody you met here, like Hubert Humphrey or Phil Burton or Carl Albert, and your interest in the issue back of that headline and the people back of that headline, I think, has been heightened by what you've this program, Jerry, and I think it's a great example of bringing that terrible, terrible bureaucracy of Washington back to the soil and the people of America in simple, direct terms. And I want to say one other thing, and then I'll stop talking. You give very straight answers, and you're a non-politician in the eyes of many of the voters in your district and your area, certainly your state. And I think that the American people today are looking for non-politicians, the people who are going to give them straight answers, honest answers, but who know the issues, who know the problems, who are not tied down by either a liberal label or a conservative label or a middle-of-the-road label. Today, they want people like Jerry Litton, who I think, who say, well, here's a new problem, let's find a new solution, and not be afraid to try. That's the significance of what you've done with this program and with your period in Congress, with your service in Congress, and I'm very proud of you.
You're very kind. Thank you. Questions, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of them asked today. We have 3 microphones. Question right over here.
Would you review for us what your father put forth to the people of America, and they trusted obviously 4 different times, so that today we can get behind that type of candidates again? We can't bring your father back, but we can bring those that are here to follow what he put down for us. Thank you.
1933, March 4th, was quite a different situation than it is today. On March 4th, the banks were going bankrupt. There were 15 million people out of work, out of a workforce, an available workforce of 60 million, 25%. Today we've got more people employed than we ever haven't had in our history, over 86 million. But we also have 7.5 or 7.6% unemployment. Now, that's somewhat the degree of the difference. Businesses are not going broke. Banks are not going broke. So we've got a refinement of the same problems, particularly unemployment. Now, what did he do? Of course, I won't have to review the whole first 100 days, the famous 100 days. But he closed the banks for a week. And those of you who didn't have a few bucks in your pocket had trouble getting the groceries to keep the family going. He closed the banks, but then they reopened with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guaranteeing your deposits and everybody else's deposits in those banks. So that stabilized the banking industry. Many of you, like I am, were farmers. And you were losing your farms. In fact, there were a lot of banks who didn't want to take over your farms, but they had to. They foreclosed. They didn't know what to do with them. My father stopped the foreclosures, put a moratorium on mortgages, so you could live on the farm, continue to produce. And I remember those were the days of 5-cent corn and 6-cent wheat. And I just was sitting next to a gentleman who told me that he was selling hogs in those days for 2.5 cents a pound. That's pretty. That's not so far, not so long ago. One, I think that's important to remember. My father did not believe in the dole. He felt that a man lost his self-respect if the government gave him something for nothing. Now today, of course, I think one of our problems, we do have the unemployment insurance. Then he started the WPA and the PWA, which put men back to work and restored their self-confidence. Sure, they were only getting 42 bucks a week, if that, sometimes less in parts of the country. But they got their self-confidence back. They came home at the end of the week with a paycheck, and Mom could go out and buy the groceries. Now, today we have unemployment insurance. We have welfare for those whose unemployment insurance has run out. Of course, it's been extended in many states. I think that, very frankly, if my father was living today, he'd apply the same theory to welfare. Obviously, elderly people who don't have Social Security should be protected by welfare. The infirm and the sick, mothers with children, mothers out of work with children, must be protected. Children must be protected. But there are a lot of people. I saw recently an estimate that it runs somewhere around 15% of men, able-bodied men, who could work and, in my opinion, should work. And it's destroying their morale if they sit home and just draw a welfare check. So I think we have... You know, it's funny. When I say that, I'm sure that some people say he sounds like a conservative. This was what my father preached when he started the WPA and the PWA, and he is the hero of liberals. So the labels change, but the principles of individual decency and self-respect continue.
I would suggest that many of the things that I've been saying on the welfare system, your father would support. I've said time and again, what we need to do is to take the welfare system, try to put it under one umbrella, eliminate all the duplication.
Yeah.
There's no need to have social workers duplicating one effort right after the other to determine who can qualify for one or another program. And secondly, I think we could make a very simple requirement in welfare, and that is that everybody on welfare, those too old to work or unable to work must either accept a job or accept public work or not qualify for welfare, period.
I agree. I agree, Jerry. That's exactly my philosophy today. There is one group, though, that I think that the presidential candidates, the senatorial candidates, the congressional candidates have to start paying attention to. And that's our out-of-school, out-of-work young people, 25 and under. And when you look at the statistics, 20% of our 25 and under young people are out of school and out of work. And when you get into the minority groups, it's 40%. Of course, that's give or take a few percentage points. It's primarily, as far as minority groups, an urban problem. My concern, and Jerry, I'm sure it's yours, if a young man gets out of high school at 18 and he can't find a job until he's 25, he's going to lose faith in the American system. And God knows where he's going to turn.
You know, Franklin, we're living in a very sophisticated society now in terms of jobs. You just don't go out of high school and do manual labor. You've got to be able to handle computers and very sophisticated equipment. And I've got a bill that's laying on my desk that I'll be introducing very shortly, which reaches out to the problem that you've talked about. It assumes that if a high school education was important 20, 30 years ago, that some kind of education beyond high school is equally important today. And my bill will provide a type of voucher system beyond high school upon graduation or 6 months following dropout, so that a youngster can take his voucher, like the old GI Bill, and take it to the institution of his choice, as opposed to sending the money to the institution and through the student. The student could then use it for, take it to a college. It wouldn't take him all the way through 4 years, or he could take it to a vocational technical school and perhaps do all of the school, pay for all of it. Welding school, beautician school, secretarial school, or a university. Now, the bill is interesting in that what I provided is, let's say a girl gets married at age 18, 19, at age 30, 35, has 2 or 3 children, is contemplating maybe divorce, a breakup in the family. She has her voucher, and she could take that back to an institution at any time she wants to be trained as a secretary, so she always knows she's not boxed in. She can be trained and equipped for a job. Now, those would say, well, that's expensive. Yes, it maybe is. But I'll tell you what, I'd rather spend money of the federal government for 1 year to train a man to be a welder than to have he and his family on welfare for 40 years because he can't weld. Yes, they can do that. Question here.
I want to ask Mr. Roosevelt a question about women in politics. I know that he comes from a background of being the son of the woman who was probably the main groundbreaker for women in politics. We'd like to know what you consider to be the current situation of the role of women in politics.
There were people back in the 40s, and late 40s and 50s who thought that my mother should run for president. She was much too modest to ever take that seriously. But I think the time is here when the woman can run for president. I think that now we ought to judge our candidates, men and women alike, on their qualifications, their ability, their answers to the problems that we face. I want to tell you, Jerry, Sharon's a pretty good wife, but she might make an awful good candidate, too.
Well, she's been telling me what to do for a long time.
There have been stories that the House of Representatives may take some sort of action against Daniel Shore and the leaks on the CIA report. Do you know what they're planning to do at this time on this question?
If intelligence information, if national security information, if this kind of data is provided to a Senate committee, and then our committees are unable to utilize that information without leaking it to the press, I think it shuts off that source of supply. I think those within the military and the executive branch are less willing to provide information tomorrow because we were not very good keepers of what they gave us yesterday. I like openness in government. I want the people to know. But my concern is not to be so poor a handler of the data that we get that we're shut off from good information tomorrow. So I would hope that whatever position the House pursues, it's one to it. The data made available to us is indeed kept as confidential as we can. Not that that in itself is important, but the information we might not get tomorrow if we didn't keep it confidential is even more important.
Thank you.
Just, can I add just one thought on this? I agree completely with what you said, Jerry. And what you're really talking about is classified international intelligence as well as foreign policy intelligence. On the other hand, I'm sure you'd agree that there is a terrible tendency among an awful lot of bureaucrats to way over-classify material over which they have some initial control. It's the kind of material that ought to be in the public domain immediately. I think that this is the fine balance.
I understand we have over 15,000 people today that are authorized to stamp classification on documents.
It's a terrible figure, frightening.
What I think is difficult for us in the House is we get so much material that's marked classified, and when we look at it, we read it in the paper yesterday.
Yeah.
You know?
Very true.
Or maybe last year, and we really can't understand why it's classified.
Yeah.
And so tomorrow at a committee meeting we get another document that appears seemingly unimportant, marked classified. And after you've seen 40 documents that don't appear to need to be classified, and another one crosses your desk that has classified on it, maybe does need to be, you can't differentiate. And I think if they were more selective, as you said, there would be a greater pull of supporting that classification. You're right. It's so easy, though. You got a bureaucrat there, he's got a decision, comes across his desk, do we classify or don't we? I don't know. Let's be sure we classify it and we send it on, and most of it shouldn't be.
And a lot of bureaucrats look upon this as a way to protect themselves, too. because nobody can look over their shoulder because they're not supposed to know what's in that piece of paper. But that's a constant, ongoing problem.
I wish I could mark classified on all of my votes.
Jerry, since the last dialogue, former President Nixon has made his sojourn into China. And this is in a lot of people a great deal of concern, and I think justifiably so. What's the attitude in Congress about this trip, and is there any thinking along the line that something should be done to keep a resigned president from continuing to meddle in American foreign policy?
Well, first let me say that I reflect back on how old John D. would have been now had he have lived and what role he might have played in our government. And he should be active, and he should be playing a dominant role where he lies today. I don't think there will ever be, let's hope, there will never be a situation quite like this one. So I would not want us to act on the basis of what Mr. Nixon did and preclude a man of the talent of John Kennedy and others from being participants because of their wealth of information and background.
I'm not suggesting that. On this particular situation, because this fellow is still around and he's going to continue apparently to be active.
Let me respond. Let me give you a...
All yours.
That's a question. I'm glad you asked it. Now, do we have any other questions? You know, I remember back, and I'll finally eventually have the nerve to answer it. But I remember back when we were in the process of the impeachment proceedings, and each of us had the occasion, opportunity or responsibility, if you would call it such, to listen to the actual tapes from the Oval Room. And I spent 7 hours one day with the earphones on listening to tapes from the Oval Room of the White House. And it was a nauseating experience. I remember back when the Patty Hearst situation occurred, and I read in the paper where she called her parents pigs, and it bothered me. But it wasn't until I heard the actual tape recording on radio and her voice refer to her parents as pigs that it made me ill. Reading the transcripts of the Nixon tapes bothered me, but it wasn't until I heard him actually speaking in the White House that I became nauseated, and I mean that very sincerely. To the extent that the next day Mr. Nixon and stepped down, and I had some 30 hours of tapes that I could have listened to. And I was so anxious to listen to them, but after hearing 7 hours and knowing that the ordeal was over, I never went back to the remaining 30-some hours. I did walk by the room one day. Not a single congressman was there. 25 earphones were laying on the table. No member of Congress even wanted to hear what we were all so eager to listen to. All of a sudden, we'd had enough. Absolutely had had enough. I brought here to this program Ed Mosvinsky 4 days after he cast the deciding vote in the Judiciary Committee to impeach the President of the United States. And I thought, here's a man that'll be on the program. We'll have insight. How did they feel? For 2 hours, you people here asking questions. You asked only 2 questions in 2 hours that had anything to do with Watergate. I couldn't believe it. But you'd had enough. Just plain had had enough. And I think the people have had enough. And I think that the bad part of Mr. Nixon going to China is not the foreign policy ramifications, but we were starting to forgive and forget. We were very compassionate, forgiving people. And there he was on the television screen again with his arrogant attitude and his self-serving statements. And it brought us right back to what we've been trying to forget a long time. I don't think we minded him being in China. I think we were kind of pleased. Maybe we were hoping he'd stay there. But it brought bad memories, and we really didn't want to be reminded of them. I think that bothered. The second thing that bothered me was as I was listening to the tapes in the Oval Room, I heard him say such things as, I'll paraphrase it, something to the effect, well, let's face it, we have no friends. As a matter of fact, that's the exact words the President used. Let's face it, we have no friends. And here was a man elected by 49 out of 50 states that at that time could have still gone many places and had people adore him. And this was a warped attitude. And here was a man very popular with the people who had been given so much, honored by so many, who after many weeks in his home in California, the first time he went out before the public, elected not to go to the streets of California or Chicago or New York or the people that had elected him, but instead to go to the streets of Peking and shake hands with the communist Chinese and pinch the cheeks of the young Chinese. And to me, this was a slap at the face of the American people, particularly Republicans who still had maintained some confidence in the man. That bothered me. I don't think he had any implications on foreign policy at all. It just brought up a bad memory. Period.
Thank you very much.
See Dialogue with Litton on KBMA TV, featuring more of Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. on Sunday, March 28th at 6 p.m. Jerry Litton is now running for U.S. Senate, where he can make things happen for all of us. If you're willing to donate your time as a volunteer worker or with your dollars, drop him a note at Post Office Box 20123, Kansas City, Missouri, 64195. The proceeding is a paid political announcement.
Jerry Litton believes that government should be open, accessible to the people, that people should have more say in their government. That's what Dialogue with Litton is all about. Be sure to watch this station for future Dialogue with Litton meetings as Jerry Litton takes government to the people.